Picture a caveman sitting by a fire, sipping a hot drink with one hand and holding a lit cigarette in the other. It sounds ridiculous, almost like a bad cartoon. But here's the twist. Parts of that image are far closer to true than you'd expect, and other parts are a complete myth. Some ancient humans really were smoking, thousands of years before modern cigarettes existed. Others really were drinking something close to coffee, centuries before Starbucks was even an idea. But ancient is doing a lot of hiding in that question, because the real answer depends entirely on which ancient humans we're actually talking about. Let's untangle exactly what's true, what's myth, and what surprised even historians. This question gets confusing fast because ancient humans can mean wildly different time periods. Are we talking about actual cavemen? Paleolithic humans living tens of thousands of years ago, long before agriculture, writing, or cities? Or are we talking about ancient in the historical sense? Early civilizations like ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, or early indigenous American cultures, which are ancient compared to us, but incredibly recent compared to true prehistoric humans? The honest answer to this video's question completely depends on which one we mean, so we're going to cover both. Let's start with the earliest humans, true Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, going back tens of thousands of years. The short answer here is simple. No, they did not have cigarettes, and they did not have coffee. Neither tobacco cultivation nor coffee cultivation existed yet in any form. These humans were focused entirely on hunting, gathering, and survival, using fire primarily for warmth, cooking, and protection, not for smoking recreational plants or brewing stimulant drinks. Any image of a true caveman smoking a cigarette or sipping coffee is pure fiction. Those innovations were still tens of thousands of years away. Tobacco has a much later, but still genuinely ancient, origin story. The tobacco plant is native to the Americas, and archaeological and botanical evidence suggests indigenous peoples in the Americas were using tobacco in some form for possibly as long as 8,000 years, with more confidently documented use going back at least 2,000 to 3,000 years. But, and this is important, this wasn't smoking cigarettes as we know them. Tobacco was primarily used in religious and ceremonial contexts, smoked in pipes during rituals, chewed, or even used in enemas and other medicinal practices by various indigenous cultures. It wasn't a casual daily habit. It was often treated as sacred, tied to spiritual practices, healing ceremonies, and communication with the spiritual world. This is where the comparison to modern cigarettes really breaks down. A modern cigarette is a highly engineered product, processed tobacco combined with hundreds of additional chemical additives, wrapped in paper, designed for mass production, and, historically, engineered to maximize nicotine delivery and addiction potential. Ancient tobacco use looked nothing like this. It was raw, unprocessed plant material, used occasionally and ceremonially rather than constantly, often smoked in pipes rather than rolled paper cigarettes, which weren't invented until relatively recently. Commercial cigarette manufacturing, as we understand it, really only took off in the 1800s and exploded in the early 1900s. So while tobacco itself is genuinely ancient, cigarettes specifically are a very modern invention. Coffee's origin story is completely separate, both geographically and in terms of timeline. Coffee comes from the coffee plant, native to the region we now call Ethiopia. According to popular historical accounts, some more legend than confirmed fact, coffee's stimulant effects were discovered when a goat herder named Kaldi noticed his goats became unusually energetic after eating berries from a certain plant. Whether or not that specific story is literally true, historians generally agree that coffee as a beverage, brewed and consumed the way we'd recognize today, emerged in the region of Ethiopia and Yemen sometime around the 9th to 15th centuries. Here's the key point. Compared to the deep history of Paleolithic humans, coffee is remarkably recent. We're talking roughly 600 to 1,000 years old as a widely consumed beverage, ancient relative to modern life, but incredibly young compared to tobacco use, and almost unimaginably young compared to true cavemen. Coffee spread through the Islamic world via trade routes, becoming deeply embedded in Middle Eastern culture, with the first coffee houses emerging in cities like Mecca and Cairo. It didn't reach Europe until roughly the 1600s, and it took even longer to become the daily ritual so many people rely on today. This creates a genuinely interesting contrast. Tobacco has thousands of years of documented ceremonial use behind it, tied deeply to indigenous spiritual and medicinal traditions long before written history in some regions. Coffee, by comparison, is a relatively recent addition to human culture, closer in age to gunpowder or the printing press than to early tool-making or fire control. Both feel ancient from a modern perspective, but they emerged during two very different chapters of human history, separated by tens of thousands of years from true prehistoric humans. It's worth highlighting how different the actual experience of using these substances was in ancient contexts compared to today. Ancient tobacco use was often communal and ceremonial, shared during specific rituals, tied to social or spiritual meaning, not something used constantly throughout the day the way modern cigarette smoking often is. Early coffee consumption in the Islamic world was also deeply social. Coffee houses became centers for conversation, music, and intellectual discussion, closer to a modern cafe's social role than a quick caffeine habit squeezed into a busy morning. Neither substance, in its earliest form, closely resembles how we casually consume cigarettes or coffee today. There's also a meaningful chemical difference worth mentioning. Ancient tobacco, consumed in raw or minimally processed form, delivered nicotine differently than modern cigarettes, which are specifically engineered, through processing techniques and chemical additives, to maximize nicotine absorption and addiction potential. Similarly, early coffee preparation methods were far less standardized than today's precisely roasted, ground, and brewed methods, meaning caffeine content and preparation varied enormously depending on region and era. Both substances existed historically, but the versions we know today are considerably more concentrated, engineered, and habit-forming than their ancient counterparts. Putting it all together, true Paleolithic cavemen tens of thousands of years ago had neither tobacco nor coffee. Those innovations simply didn't exist yet. Later, ancient and indigenous civilizations, particularly in the Americas, did use tobacco, but in ceremonial, non-cigarette form, going back thousands of years. Coffee is comparatively recent, emerging in Ethiopia and the Islamic world roughly 600 to 1,000 years ago. Ancient by everyday standards, but historically young. And modern cigarettes, specifically, are an even more recent industrial invention, only a couple hundred years old. This isn't just a trivia detail. It reveals something important about how easily we blur different eras of history together under one vague label like ancient. Tobacco's deep ceremonial roots and coffee's much later, socially driven origin tell two very different stories about how humans discovered and integrated these substances into daily life. Neither started as a casual daily habit. Both were transformed over centuries and eventually industrialized into the products we recognize today. So, did ancient humans have cigarettes and coffee? True cavemen? No, neither existed yet. Later ancient civilizations. Tobacco, yes, but ceremonial, not cigarettes. Coffee. Relatively recent, but still centuries older than most people assume, with roots in Ethiopia and the early Islamic world. It turns out the truth is more interesting than either the myth or the assumption. A story of ritual, trade, and slow transformation, stretched across thousands of years of human history. Which surprised you more? How old tobacco really is, or how young coffee actually is? Let us know in the comments, and subscribe for more videos uncovering the real history behind things we take for granted.